Welcome, everybody. Happy Wednesday to you. My name is Morgan. I am the founder of TechFleet and executive director of TechFleet. I am a UX designer and a product manager in the world. And welcome to Story Time. We're doing a new monthly talk. We in TechFleet are going to bring different guests in the community and outside of the community who have made it in the industry to tell their stories about anything that compels them in the industry. And you all are in for a special treat because I'm going to tell you about the story about how I started applying Agile UX for the first time in the world ever, and all the chaos that ensued, and the foundation that is the inspiration to how TechFleet runs to this day. And this was back in 2019. When I was on a team, I was going to school and I was working as a business analyst and going to grad school for UX. And I got a taste of Agile in the industry and waterfall in school at the same time that I was doing academic education. I was doing industry training as well. And I transitioned into tech from sales and IT and a little bit of music, the music industry. I'd had a pretty weird career trajectory before I got into software. By the time I got into grad school, I had probably over 10 years of industry experience, just working experience, because I dropped out of school and went back late. So in school, we were learning nothing but theory. And yeah, we had some projects in school, but we didn't really have anything nearly as close to what I was doing on the job. And I spent 2 years as a BA, and then I spent 2.5 years as a product owner. And during that time, we on the team were in charge of a marketing orchestration platform. And 3 years into the job, I was tasked as a product owner to make change on our products. There were several products involved. And in that process, we decided to build a process, an agile process for continuous learning. We started working with business and product teams to help inform what we might do in the future. And our lessons informed the way that these products work today, to this day. And we, in the process, shared a lot of user knowledge across the org. And what I learned, high level, is that Agile applies to UX work just like it does to dev. And I learned that by doing it. I learned how to convince people to do UX that were not UX people. I learned how to build an Agile UX process on a team from the ground up. I learned how to participate with others who weren't UX people in UX. I learned how to enable user-centered design, how to enable the process of talking to people and learning before you decide things. And I learned that you have to bring snacks everywhere you go. It all started when we had these decades-old systems. They were all talking to each other. They were all pulling data from each other in order to help marketers do their thing on the web, on email, on text. It was an orchestration platform for marketers to be able to enable themselves to do their job. And we had a lot of legacy systems. We had a lot of integrations and data feeds. We were tasked with building a new era of products. Needless to say, there was so much to do, so much work, not only on our team, but on all the other teams, and so little time to do it. There were so many back and forth meetings. There were so many decisions being made on the architectural side of the thing that other teams were going back and forth about that we had to play a role in. Eventually, we were the interface that connected all the apps together, and we were the central hub for marketers. So our product heavily affected all the other products. And at the same time, this company was super solution focused. It was very driven by technical engineers. It was very driven by business people that want to go fast and go far and don't necessarily know how to talk to people from the form of UX research like I was doing in school. So I saw a clear opportunity to learn about these problems that we were trying to solve before we did it. And at the time, I was just learning about this thing, the Agile Manifesto. Agile as it is today are 4 principles: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And it talks about nothing but software. So I get into the job and I'm a business analyst and I'm getting training in being a business analyst, which is a lot of gathering requirements and writing user stories. And it's actually a lot of UX work because you also prototype things and you build wireframes and you build user flows and you talk to people and you try to build out the ideal state for people as a business analyst. So I immediately saw the parallel between BA work and UX work. I was a UX person and I was called a BA. And in that journey, I started realizing that there's a huge gap between agile development and what I was being taught in school. And this was 2019. And I had started working through this method called Scrum that I was learning for the first time. I had no idea what Scrum was. School never taught me that. I never really heard about it before. I was blessed with someone who was coaching me the whole time. And the whole time I was doing this, I was like, well, what about UX? What about all the things that we're supposed to be doing in UX? How does this fit in? In school, I started realizing that you have an unlimited amount of time for stuff. It was all done in a vacuum. There was no business orientation to it. There were no aspects of time management to it, what we were learning in school. And yet here I was doing all this UX work that I had to do really fast, really in the agile form, and we weren't calling it UX because there were no UX designers and there were no UX researchers. So I, as a business analyst, learned about these books in school, Lean UX and Sprint. And there was another book that I read called Lean Startup. And I was fascinated with building and orchestrating things. And I wanted to solve this puzzle. I wanted to figure this mystery out. How does UX fit into the mold of Scrum? And so I read Lean UX. And Lean UX talks about how you do the UX process in 5 days. And I thought it was brilliant. And I thought it was crazy because everything I was learning in school took 6 months, 1 year, no time frame. When I was watching people work on their thesis, they were working on it for 3 years and working on original research that took 3 years. But here was Lean UX and Sprint with people on teams going out into the world and talking to people and answering questions in 5 days. That gave me an idea. What if we just started applying the rigors of these books into the work that I was doing as a BA? Not just me, but all the other teams that tried to figure out all these things that they were trying to figure out, all the complexities that they were trying to figure out. Why not just follow the process of answering questions in 5 days and try this out? Then I started to realize that the manifesto for Agile, while it talks about development, it doesn't only relate to development. This was a dawning moment in my career for me. And I didn't really get a chance to talk to anybody about it at the time because, again, there were no UX people at the job. And everybody in school was following waterfall principles. And in academia, they had no idea what this stuff was unless they experienced it. But I realized that I could change the word software in the Agile Manifesto and it still applied to my work. The Manifesto for Agile UX. We're uncovering better ways of delivering UX by doing it and helping others do it. Through the work, we've come to value individuals and interactions over processes. Okay, that checks out. Working UX over comprehensive documentation. Well, that's pretty compelling. You do it quickly. Do your research quickly. Do your design quickly. Get it into the hands of users. That was one of the biggest lessons that I learned on the job in Agile. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. That was a first for me too. Because in school, we were learning about the research process and we were learning about the analysis. We were learning that you have to figure out all the details and make your conclusions in full before you go on to design. That's not how the world worked. Not on this software team. Responding to change over following a plan. Forget the plan. They were so quick to change the plan at that job and change with the changing priorities of the users and change with the changing priorities of the business. And so this dawning moment for me was that the Agile Manifesto also applied to UX work. And all these principles still apply to UX. You can go from idea to learning about the idea. And in school, we were doing that in 6 months. And in the job, there was this compelling opportunity that we could put structure around the BA work that I was doing and learn about something, whether an idea was good or not, in 5 days, based on Lean UX and based on the book Sprint. This is a picture from Google Ventures, who created Sprint, design sprints. And in design sprints, you test prototypes. And in Lean UX, you carry out a UX method in 5 days. So after reading that book, I started to try to apply both of them into the context of my team. And I read the book and I looked at my team and I read the book and I looked at my team and I was like, that doesn't work. So rather than give up and say, oh, that book doesn't apply to my team, I'm not going to do it, I tried to fit it to the context of my team. Like my product manager who was training me told me that that's what you do in the Agile Manifesto. You fit Agile to the context of your team. So I was going to fit Agile UX to the context of my team. And my team comprised of no UX people. There were no UX people. It was me as a business analyst. It was technical solutions architects who were trying to drive the solution to things. There were product managers and product owners. Those also were not necessarily doing UX. And they all had a stake in this. All of us solve problems. That's all we do. Doesn't matter if you're in UX or not. You're trying to build product in the product life cycle. That's what you do. That's the universal consistency between all of us. Sometimes people jump right into the solution. And we in UX seek to understand the state of the world and seek to understand the problems first. We seek to try to communicate the problems. And then we need to do something about those problems. But so do product owners and business analysts and solutions architects and all the other roles that are involved. Even business people, they still solve problems. So I took the two processes that were described in Lean UX and Google Design Sprint, and I had the bright idea to try our own process in 5 days that was a mix between the two. And I called it continuous learning sprints because we were in a position where A, we had to work with a lot of different teams. B, we weren't UX people. We were trying to solve business problems for these products. And C, there were regular cadences that were happening already that were development driven. So we had an opportunity to take the work that we could be doing to explore problems to inform the architecture work, to inform the development work, to inform the planning, to inform the vision, while we were trying to learn about how users' needs need to be met. So we started on this process of, on Monday, we would do a discovery session after planning things. On Tuesday, we would whiteboard our problem solving, just like in the Google Design Sprint. On Wednesday, we'd create the test. On Thursday, we would run the test. And on Friday, we would demo it to the business and we would retro it. So we started out with this process, and it was a mix between Lean UX and Google Design Sprints. Key differences were that none of us were UX people. We didn't have full-time UX designers. We didn't have full-time UX researchers. We were product people. We were business analysts. We were business people. We had a couple of hours a week to work on sprint work because we had full-time jobs. In the book, they were dedicated to 40 hours a week working UX. They were doing all-day workshops. And that clearly wouldn't work on this team either. But we decided to mold our process to the context of the team, just like the product manager taught me. That's what you do with Agile. You take what's on paper and you mold it to the context of your team. We had sprint retrospectives. They don't talk about that in Lean UX and Google Design Sprint. But we figured it was very important because this was the first time that people who were business oriented were doing this. They're going to have opinions. They're going to need to change their process with us. And B, there is no way we could determine if this process is going to work completely. So the expectation is we would understand what went well, what didn't go well. We would change the route as we went, just like we would in a development sprint. And then we started sprinting. And the business was pretty anxious about it. Will we be taking too much time away from people's jobs? Are we even working on work that's valuable and solving the right problems? Will we talk to enough people? Will this turn out to be something that is useful? Nobody knew. All the amount of convincing and all the amount of, I read this book, listen to this book, I want to do it this way, didn't really help. We had to show people. We started small. Started sprint 1, planning work with business people to try to identify the highest risks in the product. Nobody called it UX. Nobody called it UX design. Nobody called it UX research. But that's what we were doing. That's what we were set out to do. I made a process template. We just made a document that people could use to follow the process. We agreed to whatever the goals were for the week, the sprint goals. We wrote assumptions and implications together, and we assigned tasks and roles. That was all on Monday. Tried to identify all the things that Google Design Sprints do, but in our context. On Tuesday, we went to brainstorm the problems that we were trying to solve and tried to brainstorm some of the assumptions and break them down more. Again, we were business analysts and product owners and solutions architects. We weren't UX people. We were doing UX work. It was a little secret that I kept in my back pocket the whole time. Aha, we're doing UX work. Nobody's calling it UX. It's just UX. And that's a reality I kind of like crashed into in the world, that UX isn't always a dedicated role, but doesn't mean that you're not doing user-centered design. It doesn't mean that you don't have an opportunity to do user-centered design. We decided on Tuesday, just like the Google design sprint, how are we going to test those assumptions? We had decided that we were going to do a card sort, interviews, and an analytics audit all in the same week. We did it. On Wednesday, we created the test materials. We reviewed it with the team. Keep in mind, we're not working on this stuff all day. We're working on this stuff for a couple hours a week. So made it happen. We ran a pilot test too, to try to identify what we might need to change before Thursday. On Thursday, we went out into the world. We hit the streets, ran the tests. We didn't recruit prior. We did what's called guerrilla UX. You go out into the street and you go start talking to people. We split off into our assigned groups that we had already agreed to on Monday. Some people looked at analytics. We all reported back on Friday. We demoed the results. We demoed the results to the business and took those results and reprioritized what we might do after the results. Then we took a retrospective. We talked a lot about the process. We talked a lot about people's fears that they had coming into this thing. We talked about how we might change the process for Sprint 2. We did. We made agreements on what would happen in what days, how people would get involved. We tried to figure out what are we going to reprioritize in terms of our problems, because we didn't pick our problems for Sprint 2. Not until that point. We did the sprint and then we prioritized what we would do next, just like an agile development team. But we were doing UX work. And then sprint 2 through 6 is history in the books. It was off to the races. We just repeated the same process. We learned, we explored, we got new people involved. Sometimes we ran usability tests. Sometimes we ran prototype tests. Sometimes we covered topics that had to do with interviewing people. And sometimes the results came back and we had more unknowns than answers. We didn't have answers in the first week. We talked about really complex business problems that had to do with a lot of different personas, like an accounting problem that didn't really have to do with our system, but the data affected our system. And we had to go back to the drawing boards internally and then go back and do another sprint to validate an idea that we had to fix it. All the while, we were following the Agile Manifesto for UX. Individuals and interactions, working UX, customer collaboration, responding to change. That's all we did. We pivoted like champions. We didn't know what the plan was. We didn't need to know what the plan was. We just needed to know what our goals were and how we might need to change at any moment. This is exactly what we did. We still had that outcome and goal in mind. We still had the outcome to achieve it. At the end of these 2 months, we need to know exactly what we're building in those new apps. This is how our process changed. In Sprint 2, we decided to only do demo on Friday because what we learned in retro was that people seemed a little stressed to run both in the same day because they were part-time. So we tried it out with the new process flow in Sprint 2. Sprint 3, we had an opportunity to test and do whiteboarding early. So we started all that stuff on Monday. Instead of just waiting for the next day, we started doing a whiteboarding session on Monday and Tuesday. And we took 2 days to test. And we didn't do demo on Friday. because we decided to change the process ourselves. And that's what real Agile teams do when you're doing Agile on industry teams. You self-organize. You respond to change over following a plan. That applies to your process just as much as it applies to the work. In sprint 4 and 5, we stuck with the same process. After we kind of iterated on that a little bit, we had an opportunity to maybe test on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday we tested. But we didn't know that ahead of time. We just kind of let things play out as they would while we were running in sprints. The business loved it. They absolutely loved it. They were so anxious in the beginning, and then they started seeing the results and the fruits of the efforts that the team was going through. They became way more enthusiastic. They started exploring problems themselves. They wanted to do more UX work, and nobody called it UX. User knowledge across the teams grew. People were so solution-driven before. And just in those 6 weeks of seeing results from doing Agile UX and seeing how similar it is to Agile development, business people and product owners and product managers started empathizing with users more. They started learning how their systems were actually used because they didn't really talk to people. But they did after this. They started getting more aligned in problem solving and working together and working across departments, which wasn't happening before. They learned how other kinds of users behaved that didn't have to do with their product, but related to them in some way, shape, or form. There were times where product decisions were made in one product because they had knowledge of a user that they never had before. Strategy grew across the business. Sprint learnings became product vision. We prioritized problems based on sprint work, and it turned into really valuable things for people. We helped other teams align in all that strategy together. We were all moving in the same direction. It was so great. It was the first time this was ever happening at the business. And then I got laid off. And me and a bunch of other people got laid off right before the thing ships. And post all of this, I have no idea if any of it panned out. I really don't. I can only conjecture. I can only talk through what I think. All these systems were private. They're not public enterprise systems. And I have to keep thinking about myself saying that it was no fault of me. It was not something that I can control. But we still produced amazing user-centered design work. Flashback to 2020. I always had that in my head. Ever since those sprints, exploring business problems, doing parallel research and design with development, helping businesses strategize through answering questions quickly, sharing user knowledge, iterating on the process, doing it with people that aren't UX people. All of that exists in TechFleet today. I brought it to TechFleet from day one because of that experience. That was the crash course that school could never, ever, 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 ever have taught me. And this is what I learned from it. You just got to start doing stuff. Don't keep talking about it forever. Don't keep talking about the what ifs. Just start doing things, agree to the thing that you're about to do, agree why it's important, and iterate on it. Allow the people that aren't UX people to do the work with you. The more you do it with non-UX people, the more perspectives you're going to bring, and the more you're going to spread the UX perspective and the user-centered design perspective. Build in public. Show the results of your work in public. Show the results of the sprints to other teams. Show them what you're doing. Show them why. You never know who's trying to listen and look for opportunities to pick up that new type of work. The more people that know about Agile UX, the more it spreads. The more knowledge you can share about users, the more you're showcasing that you are solving these problems, the more it's going to spread in the organization. The more you're going to actually be able to evangelize UX. And you don't need to call it UX. Nobody needs to call it UX. UX is a jargon term. UX research, UX design, it's super interpretive. But if you show by doing and you show by participating in business problems that you're trying to solve, that's the stuff that cuts through the noise. Anybody can speak that language at the business. Don't ever forget to bring snacks when you're performing UX research live. People love it. They appreciate it. Just don't make it sway your results. And don't forget to bring the snacks. And that's my story. And I'd love to hold discussion for several minutes. If y'all have questions or stuff you want to talk about, I'm all ears. Let's talk about it. Cupcakes and beer were the favorite snacks at the time. Also, I will say that for context, there was a pretty unique setup at this company. We had a campus of sorts. It was like a pretty small company compared to like larger companies, but there were a bunch of buildings that had different offices in the same vicinity. And so as a UX researcher, I could go out and go visit those different offices and pick conversations with different people that were completely different personas like very quickly. So it was a little bit of a unique setup. And these days, a lot of things are remote. So it was like a pretty different world back then before the pandemic. It still applies today, I would say. Why would be the reasons Agile wasn't used by UX people? Well, it's not something that we're trained in. We're not trained in Agile. Uh, I wasn't trained in Agile. I was trained in the phased approach of work. And I was trained in the I was trained in what's called waterfall, which is where you build in phases and it's sequential and you don't talk to anybody until the end. And you do your research all up front and then you stop doing research at a certain point and you start doing design. And there's a completely different way to do work in the industry. Agile is so different than what I was trained in school. Lean UX is a great book. Sprint is a great book. Don't let Sprint fool you. Sprint and Google Design Sprints talk about prototype testing. You don't need to do just prototype testing to do Agile UX. You can do any research method in 5 days. The caveat with that is that you look for patterns and you have a pattern analysis approach. And you talk to less people than you would normally in 1 week versus 2 weeks or versus 3 weeks. Or let's say your sprints are a little bit longer. That's cool. You can take that long to do your work, but you don't have to take longer to do your work. You can still do it in 2 days. You can do that test in 2 days. How do you go about with the challenges of navigating this in the current world of online work? Yeah, it's certainly possible. And it changes the cadence a little bit. Sometimes you have to schedule up front if you know that the work is coming. And I think that like to go along the lines of the Agile philosophy, I don't have a plan ahead of time. I work it out with my team. So we figure it out together. I'm not the person with the answers on a team that's doing Agile UX. The team should be self-organizing and coming together and deciding how they want to proceed in the moment. Depends on the problem, depends on the work that you have, depends on the priorities. So I'll facilitate conversation around that stuff. And I'll leave it to a consensus on the team to figure out together. I'm not going to dictate that stuff. It's a great question. Has anybody in the room ever tried this stuff? Has anybody in the room ever read Lean UX or Sprint and then tried it? I'm very curious. And if you haven't tried it, have you read the book? Anybody here read the book?
Hi, Morgan.
Hey,
Thought it would be easier to, to show my voice and
yeah,
not in any shape or form to show my video back and
you're
at least
good.
talk. It's faster to talk. So I just wanted to share that I have because I came from I'm a boot camp graduate, so they taught the sprint one, and I've read it, tried it for a project, and while it's fascinating, but it's definitely not easy to do it alone. So I just want to share that it probably makes a lot more sense to do sprint in a small group, so you kind of get a consensus on things and move forward. And that's why I'm really grateful for you creating Tech Fleet, having that environment to do that. So I'm really
Yeah,
looking forward to it to be on one of the projects.
that's cool. Yeah, are you applying to projects right now?
Yes, I apply
Nice.
to projects, and yeah, their deadlines hasn't ended yet or will
Yeah,
be soon, so we'll see.
cool. That's great. Yeah, I will say you can definitely run sprint solo. You can run a sprint solo. I do it all the time. If you know your process and you just are the person that makes the decisions and you kind of follow the same framework, but
Yeah,
you don't have different people, you can just do the same type of work alone.
yeah, yeah.
It is
Um,
great doing it with a team, you
yeah,
know.
it's easier to kind of decide, on things. You just
Hmm.
take a vote, but just doing it
Yeah.
alone, you kind of have to, okay, fighting with my own inner voice and just pick one.
Yeah. Which I think is a muscle to flex. You know what I mean? It's like that is a skill to build to make that
Yeah,
judgment call in the moment of how you're going to decide anything in sprints. That's a skill. And like practicing that alone is a very different thing than practicing that in a team.
yeah,
But I think it's still really important to like maybe not at the beginning of your journey, but at some point in your UX journey, the more you can operate solo, the more you can bring to the table for whatever opportunity that you're doing. And you can kind of like bring other people into the mix on the fly too, like people that aren't UX people, you
yeah,
know. So it brings like new powers that you may have never had when you started.
yeah. And I'm also actually interested now that, talking about the benefits of doing sprint solo. Um, I'm just very interested in your take on what if, I mean, it happens a lot. The stakeholders are interested in one direction, and you just start the research, and you're thinking, well, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but I think this other hypothesis makes more sense to me. So how do you balance that, like in terms of your research direction, like the balance of
Yeah.
it and
I,
communicating with stakeholders?
I treat it like a scientist. I'm going to go follow that path that they think is right into research. And I'm going to work objectively to try to validate or invalidate that hypothesis. Any hypothesis will do. It doesn't matter what sprint work you take on. If you have an assumption that's different than others about the work that's valuable, if you put it into the sprint, you'll test whether it's valuable. If you don't put it into the sprint, you'll never know. So I want to put it into the sprint. I want to prioritize those risky assumptions and always test those up front. And if you have a team doing this stuff, you might be working on multiple questions at once. But I put my scientist hat on and I say, all right, that's an assumption. We're going to test that assumption client with users.
Mhm. And what if you haven't gone to like any prototype testing yet? You're kind of just on a research phase.
Yeah.
Would you gear the like collecting, let's say you're collecting qualitative information based on interviews, like would you do the same to kind of shift the questions towards one or like what you're leaning towards, the
No,
hypothesis?
no, I wouldn't bias it like that. I would just leave it objective and collect what needs to be collected from the research. And whatever method is best
Okay,
is the best method to use. So if it's
okay,
a concept test for a prototype, like Google Design Sprint does, great. If it's interviews, great. If it's a survey, awesome. Doesn't matter. But it's what's really important is to bring objectivity to it and to not bias anything and to pick the right method to test that assumption. So there's a process that Google Design Sprint goes over in terms of identifying assumptions, writing out the implications of those assumptions, picking the assumptions that you want to choose in the test. And that sequential process really helps to always make sure that you're headed in the right problem solving direction.
okay, makes sense. I have to go
Yeah.
back and reread the book a lot.
It's a
Yes,
lot of things to consider at once. You know what I mean?
yes.
The Agile UX masterclass, you jump right into all of this. You do
Okay,
everything that I'm talking about in the Agile UX masterclass.
that's awesome.
Um,
I'll definitely sign up.
yeah, it's like great practice. This stuff comes with doing. You have to do it. Um, to you don't ever get perfect with it because Agile is never perfect. Nothing that you implement with Agile is going to be perfect. You're never going to create a perfect outcome. You're never going to create a perfect design. You're never going to finish what you start because everything is going to change around you. And you need to change with that change. You need to respond to the change. So it's like a way of working that's very different than what you're taught in school. You
Mm,
don't do things in phases in Agile. You just do things continuously. You do things in parallel. You do research and design and development in
mm,
perpetuity forever and ever and ever. You never stop. It's just a
mm.
matter of which research you take on and which design you take on. So it's a very different way of working. Doing is the best way to learn it.
Got it. Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming up on stage and talking about it.
Hey Morgan, I have a question.
Yeah.
What, I guess, best practices or tips do you have when it comes to like thinking about your capacity planning,
Mhm.
when it comes to agile? So like you're running sprints, you're, kind of deciding um what stories are worked on for the 2 week sprint. And then pulling that from the backlog. So how do you determine like the capacity of what you think you're able to get done?
Great question. There's a process called planning poker. Uh, there's a phrase in product ownership called level of effort estimation. And you basically have to understand how fast you can do work as a team to understand what's too much work. So if you can have an average on the team through level of effort estimation to say, this is how much work we usually get done in one sprint, then you have what's called the velocity, the speed of the team. And once you have the velocity of the team, you can better estimate that, but you're literally shooting in the dark if you don't have the velocity, and that's okay. You make a best judgment call about what you think is too much work. You better be taking on the most important priorities at once and picking the top two, picking the top one, picking the top three. And if you and your team, not just you solo, but your team has an agreement that they're confident that they can finish that work, you just keep revisiting it through the sprint. Because again, life changes in the middle of the work. You think you can do the work, and then you start doing the work and you realize how crazy it is. So you have to rescope and cut things out. And pivoting is absolutely necessary. Sometimes you're pivoting in such a way that you just cut things out of the sprint. And that's a natural occurrence. That happens all the time, especially when teams start working together and they don't have a velocity. But the velocity helps you get more steady with that. Does that help, Rita?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You do the same thing with development work. You measure your velocity, you measure your level of effort estimation. You do the same thing with UX. You do the same thing with any type of work on Agile. Great question. Melissa, you said you ran design sprints at your organization. That's really cool. That's awesome. Was it similar to what I described, or was it different for you? Then you're welcome to come on. I'll come off mute and talk about it. Let me see if she's still here. Okay, Melissa is no longer on the call. It's all good. I'm very curious about it. Next person who had a question was Lindsay. I guess a statement. Lindsay said, I feel like my bootcamp taught it more theoretically than practically, though I think we used agile methods in breaking down the projects. Like Jessica said, it feels different solo than it would on a team. Yeah, totally. It feels very different solo. Feels very different in a business atmosphere too. But I think that the stuff you do in school is great practice. And if you know you're gonna change and morph going into the sprint work at the business, if you can bring a process to the table, you're going to bring so much value to the table. Yeah, fighting with your inner voice is hard. And the more you get practice and to remove the fear of perfection in your mind, which is really hard, you will get more confident with this might not pan out and I'm going to try it and that's okay. We're going to pivot if we need to. And let's try it. Let's experiment. It's one thing to do that solo. It's another thing to do that on a whole team, because you're combating with other people that have a fear of perfection, and they all have to have the same mindset in order for you to be able to do that together. That's a part of getting used to Agile and working with people that are Agile and Agile coaching. Helena, you said you've read Lean UX. You worked on a team that used Agile principles. We had daily stand-ups, weekly product meetings, and retros, and that was a great experience. And our team was aligned most of the time. Sometimes we had additional meetings if we needed to clarify something or pivot. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Sounds like you all ran your own Agile UX process. That's really cool. It's like a different flavor every time you do it. And that's kind of on purpose because you fit it into the context of your team. But running stand-ups makes sense. And doing weekly product meetings makes sense. If it makes sense to you all on the team. Do you think that there are any cons of the agile process? Yeah. I think that if you mismanage it, you could easily be wasting a lot of work. You could be doing things quickly and not efficiently and feel like you're just kind of like cyclically spinning your wheels if you don't take on the most important work and you don't finish what you start. So there are approaches in sprint agile coaching and Scrum Master to make sure that does not happen. To like coach people around all that stuff. The best way to build confidence in this and to remove the fear of perfection is to start doing it. And if you do it in the structured environment, like you do it in the Agile UX masterclass, or you do it in a project in Tech Fleet, you're with your peers. You're not with an Agile coach. So you're doing things and you're just flying by the seat of your pants in your own process with the team. And nobody's going to tell you, this is how you typically do it. This is how you typically don't do it. None of that. And that's like the real world. That's how it was for me running continuous learning sprints for the first time. Product operations is this. It's all of this. Building a process for doing research work, building a process for doing design work, and building a process for informing development is product operations. That's like how a product team works. And it's part of product management. Every product management person has to have a process on a team, and that process is product ops. Does that make sense, Mia? Product ops is at the heart of everything.
Yes, that makes sense. It's just so different from where I come from, in a waterfall environment. And product managers are more strategic, forward thinking, market. They do all the research and the market trends and everything. Product operations in my world, my old world, really made sure that the operations behind the scene went smoothly, that the products went to market, and if there was any problems or any hiccups throughout the process, they would inform me, and then I would have to make different processes. But so I would be more of the strategic person, and then product ops would be executing. We work in tandem, they would do a lot of that. So that was why I was asking how does this relate to product ops?
Yeah, it's a good point. That is a great example of product operations at play. That company defined what a product manager was, what a product owner was, how the product teams work. And that definition is product operations. They may not have called it product operations, but it sounds like they were doing product operations, and it's like the change management on the product team, which is operations on the product. And that's cool that you all had a dedicated operational team for product. That's awesome. That's not very common in my experience. And maybe it is the case with was that a larger company?
Yes.
Yeah, that probably would be happening at a larger company. That makes sense. It also depends on the scale of the company too. Like my company that I work for full time, we have about 15,000 employees, and we do what's called scaled agile framework, which is a bunch of sprint teams that are centrally planned from a larger sprint team called the program. So you've got a program manager, and then you've got a product manager, and then you've got many product managers and many product owners. And in the scaled agile framework operations, you're all centrally planning off of the same roadmap, but you're doing sprints in parallel. And that is product operations for scaled agile framework. And sometimes there's no name to what they're doing. They're just operating in their process that they've built themselves most of the time it doesn't have a name. Like they do a method, but their process is defined piece by piece, team by team, company by company. Somebody's got to make that process. At the companies I've worked at before, it's been me and a product owner and a product manager figuring out, okay, what's the way that we should work? When work comes in, what decisions need to be made? What things need to be documented? How do we move it forward? What do we decide whether to move it forward? And how do we make those decisions? Let's flowchart it out. That's product operations. When you figure out what you're trying to do as a product team and how you work, that's the subject of product operations.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
sounds like you did, like your company did product operations to the T, you know?
Not really.
Well, you said that they
Theoretically,
changed the way that they like worked on product teams, and that's how I would expect it to work too.
yeah. Theoretically, it was fine, but we pretty much the product managers pretty much had to dictate or tell them like what needed to be done
Yeah.
and how.
Yeah.
So theoretically, it did sound nice,
Yeah.
but we ended up doing the whole work. So that's why I think I was a little confused, you know.
I got you. Yeah. Yeah. In short, it takes all types. Like every single company is different. Every single team
Yeah.
is different.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Okay.
yeah, it kind of takes this perspective to like realize that, oh, it's not the same everywhere you work. There is no consistency to any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And then you learn
Exactly.
how to build it in the context of a team. And that's product operations.
Yeah, that's interesting because every time I listen to you about UX design and everything, I'm more interested in the products ops, I guess, and I guess it would be translated to UX design. So I think you're kind of shifting my focus here,
Whoa,
which I think is
that's
very
awesome.
good, you know? No, it's very great. I love
That's
it.
awesome. Yeah, that's great. It's it's all like there's so many similarities between all of them that it's like harder to put a label on them.
Yeah.
It can be UX design, it can be product ownership, but I guess it depends on the work that's being done, you know?
Yeah. I guess it depends on the company, the industry, and the type of product you're working
Yeah,
on too, because that would
totally.
warrant the different role changes. Yeah.
Yep, that's very
Okay.
true.
Yeah.
All right, people. Well, thanks for coming to story time. I hope you enjoyed it. And if anybody ever wants to like talk one-on-one, for like mentorship or discussions or anything, like just reach out. I'm here. Yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for attending. I'll see you all around Tech Fleet and see you next month. And Ken Terra is coming to talk about AI and the world of craziness that she's in right now. So that's going to be a really great one. Bye, peeps.